Marie Antoinette was one of the most misrepresented and misunderstood women of her time, and this is her story.
Marie Antoinette, the last Queen of France. On October 16, 1793, a woman climbed 13 wooden steps to the scaffold in the heart of Paris. She wore a plain white dress, the mourning color of French queens, her hair shorn close to the scalp, her hands bound behind her back. The crowd that surrounded her was enormous, and it was not silent. She was 37 years old. She had been a wife at 14, a queen at 18, a prisoner at 35, and a widow at 37. She had been the most scrutinized woman of her age. In an era before photographs existed, she had been caricatured, lampooned, tried, and despised. She had also been a devoted mother, a patron of the arts, and a woman thrust, before she had any real understanding of the world, into one of the most volatile stages in the history of Western civilization. Her name was Marie Antoinette, and almost nothing you think you know about her is entirely true. She was born on November 2nd, 1755, at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, and already the date carried an omen. November 2nd is All Souls' Day, a Catholic day of mourning for the dead. The Habsburg court found this so discomfiting that her birthday was quietly moved to November 1st, All Saints' Day, for the whole of her childhood. A life reframed before it had properly begun. Her full name at birth was Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna. She was the 15th child of Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and Empress Maria Theresa, who ruled the Habsburg monarchy with an uncommon fusion of iron calculation and maternal devotion. Maria Theresa had given birth to all her previous 14 children without serious incident. Marie Antoinette's delivery was so complicated that doctors feared the empress would not survive it. She did survive, but the birth augured the turbulence that would follow her youngest daughter across a continent. The world Marie Antoinette entered as an infant was Schönbrunn Palace in summer and the Hofburg in winter. Gilded ceilings, mirrored halls, an imperial court governed by ritual and precedents, as rigid as geometry. She was raised among 16 siblings, and was by all accounts a charming, affectionate child, if not a studious one. By the age of 10, she could not write correctly in German, French, or Italian. Her tutors were gentle with her. Her mother was not. There is a detail about her childhood that stands apart from all the court portraits and diplomatic correspondence. On October 13th, 1762, when Marie Antoinette was 6 years old, her 7th birthday still 3 weeks away, a boy named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart visited Schönbrunn Palace to perform for the imperial family. According to legend, the young Mozart slipped on the polished marble floor of the hall. Marie Antoinette helped him up. He declared, in the way that 6-year-olds sometimes declare things with absolute seriousness, that he would marry her when he grew up. Whether the story is apocryphal or not, it places two of the 18th century's most iconic figures in the same room before either of them had any idea who they would become. She studied the harp, the harpsichord, and the flute under the instruction of Christoph Willibald Gluck, one of the era's most influential composers. She sang during her family's evening gatherings. She danced. By every account, she had remarkable natural grace, what contemporaries called an exquisite carriage, the posture of someone who has never been allowed to slouch. She also loved dolls. She was still very much a child. To understand Marie Antoinette, you have to understand the political machinery that produced her circumstances. France and Austria, the House of Bourbon and the House of Habsburg, had been hereditary enemies for centuries. The rivalry was so fundamental that it had been woven into the fabric of European diplomacy like a load-bearing wall. Then came the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, which reshuffled the continent's alliances with stunning speed, and suddenly France and Austria found themselves on the same side. The alliance needed to be sealed. The traditional method was a marriage. Marie Antoinette was identified as the instrument of that sealing when she was around 10 years old. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was a formidable woman by any measure, a ruler who governed 40 million people, commanded armies, and negotiated treaties with the ruthlessness of the finest diplomats of her century. She wrote her daughters exhaustive letters on conduct, posture, hygiene, and the management of a husband's affections. She deployed her children the way generals deploy infantry, strategically and without excessive sentiment about the cost. Marie Antoinette was to marry Louis Auguste, grandson of King Louis XV of France and heir to the French throne. She was prepared for this marriage the way one prepares an ambassador or a sacrifice. Tutors descended on the Habsburg to correct her French, which was imperfect, and her German penmanship, which was worse. A Parisian dentist was brought to Vienna to straighten her teeth. Her hair was restyled. The Austrian archduchess was being systematically converted into a French dauphine, detail by detail, and the conversion had a deadline. What no one adequately prepared her for was the French court itself, a world where the wrong gesture at the wrong moment, witnessed by the wrong person, could detonate a political crisis before breakfast. She was 14 years old when the preparations concluded. On April 19th, 1770, she was married by proxy in Vienna, meaning Louis Auguste was represented at the altar by her own brother, Archduke Ferdinand, who stood in for a man she had never met. Then she was placed inside a procession of 57 carriages, 117 footmen, and 376 horsemen, and sent westward across Europe. At the border of France and the Habsburg territories, in a specially constructed building on a small island in the Rhine River near Strasbourg, a ceremony took place that was both practical and theatrical. Everything Austrian was stripped from Marie Antoinette, her Habsburg ladies-in-waiting, her Austrian-born servants, her clothes, even her dog. France was taking delivery of a French dauphine, not an Austrian archduchess. She crossed into France wearing French dress, with a French retinue. Her name itself changed from Maria Antonia to Marie Antoinette. She crossed that border and did not look back. She was given no choice. She met Louis Auguste for the first time on May 14th, 1770, at the edge of the forest of Compiègne. He arrived on horseback. She descended from her carriage. He embraced her. In the diary he kept, a document notable for its brevity, Louis Auguste recorded the entirety of that encounter in 4 words: interview with Madame la Dauphine. He was 15. She was 14. Their formal wedding took place 2 days later, on May 16th, 1770, in the Palace of Versailles. 20,000 people attended the celebrations. The fireworks display that evening was so magnificent that it killed several spectators in a crowd crush in Paris. The new Dauphine is said to have wept when she heard the news. Versailles, in 1770, was unlike anything that exists in the modern world. It housed some 10,000 people, courtiers, servants, tradespeople, petitioners, within its walls and grounds. It had been the seat of French royal power since Louis XIV moved the court there in 1682, and in the 90 years since, it had built layer upon layer of protocol, hierarchy, and ritual so complex that navigating it required the skills of a diplomat and the memory of a chess grandmaster. Nothing at Versailles was unwitnessed. The king and queen dressed before an audience, in a ceremony called the levee, attended by courtiers ranked according to calibrated privilege, who could hand the queen her chemise, who could assist with her gloves, who was present when she drank her morning chocolate. The queen bathed in her linen dressing gown, buttoned to the neck. The court watched. The court always watched. Marie Antoinette found this suffocating. She was a teenager from Vienna, accustomed to comparative informality, dropped into a world where her every movement was choreographed and catalogued. Her response, which would prove fateful, was to carve out spaces where she could breathe. She arrived at Versailles without a single person she had chosen. Every face in that palace had been assigned to her by protocol, by rank, by the political calculations of others. It is worth remembering that when we talk about Marie Antoinette's friendships, when we examine the women she drew close to and held there, we are talking about the only genuine human choices she was permitted to make. The first was the Princesse de Lamballe. Marie Therese Louise of Savoy was born in Touraine in 1749, married at 17 to a French prince who died within a year, and arrived at Versailles as a young widow before Marie Antoinette arrived as a young bride. The two women found each other around 1771, and what developed between them was, by the standards of that heavily observed world, something close to extraordinary. Marie Antoinette would say of her friend openly that the Princesse de Lamballe's friendship was the charm of her life. In 1775, she appointed her superintendent of the Queen's household, one of the most senior positions at court, over the protests of advisers who found the choice too personal, too conspicuous. The princess was not a wit. She was not a political schemer. She suffered from what her contemporaries described as nerves and convulsions, sometimes remaining unconscious for hours. She was sensitive, loyal, and by every account without the appetite for intrigue that Versailles ran on. These were not qualities the court valued. They were, perhaps, exactly the qualities Marie Antoinette needed. The Duchesse de Polignac, Yolande de Polastron, came later and burned brighter. Where Lamballe was gentle, Polignac was vivid, amusing, and surrounded by a circle of friends whose company the queen found irresistible. By the early 1780s, Marie Antoinette had drawn closer to the Polignac set than to any other in the court. The favor she showed them was lavish: appointments, pensions, access, and it cost her politically in ways she either did not see or chose not to weigh. The pamphlets that accused her of a romantic attachment to the Duchesse were, like most of what the pamphlets printed, almost certainly fabricated. What was real was the ease, the hours of laughter that neither woman had to perform. When the Revolution fractured the world of Versailles in 1789, the Duchesse de Polignac fled France. She went into exile and did not return. Marie Antoinette reportedly wept when they parted, and then never spoke bitterly of her. The Princesse de Lamballe went the other way. She had been in England when the monarchy began to collapse. She did not have to come back. She had her own family, her own resources, a life she could have continued at a safe remove from the catastrophe unfolding in Paris. She came back anyway. She wrote to émigrés urging them to return and support the royal family. She organized what she could. When a mob stormed the Tuileries on June 20th, 1792, she stood beside the Queen. A witness recorded that she displayed greater courage than anyone present. She is said to have told a visitor, in this period, that as the danger grew, she felt more strength. In August 1792, she was separated from the royal family and transferred to the prison of La Force. On September 3rd, she was brought before one of the makeshift tribunals assembled during the massacres sweeping the Paris prisons that week. She was asked to swear an oath against the monarchy. She refused. She was killed. Her head was mounted on a pike and carried through the streets to the Temple prison, where Marie Antoinette was being held, and raised before the Queen's windows. Marie Antoinette is said to have collapsed when she saw it. The Princesse de Lamballe was 42 years old. She had not been required to come back to France. She had come back because she had said she must live and die with her queen. History, which records the deaths of kings and the fall of dynasties, kept its word on her behalf. The gossip began almost immediately. 7 years after their wedding night, the marriage of Louis Auguste and Marie Antoinette had not been consummated. 7 years. The court knew. The Austrian court knew. The King of France knew. The dispatches flying between Vienna and Versailles, between Empress Maria Theresa and her ambassador in Paris, between the Empress and Marie Antoinette herself, were dense with anxiety, implication, and increasingly frank instruction. The precise cause has never been settled. Louis was widely believed to have a physical condition. The most common theory involved a minor anatomical irregularity correctable by surgery, though some historians contend the issue was simply inexperience, mutual shyness, and an almost complete lack of anyone willing to give either of them useful guidance. The young Dauphin was more interested in hunting and locksmithing than in his wife. Marie Antoinette, for her part, had received no instruction in the mechanics of marriage before her departure from Vienna. Her mother, who wrote at length on conjugal duty in general terms, had apparently never explained the specifics. What this 7-year gap produced was not merely embarrassment. It produced a political crisis, because the king's brothers, the Comte de Provence and the Comte d'Artois, stood to inherit the throne if Louis and Marie Antoinette produced no legitimate heir. And the king's brothers had every incentive to ensure the marriage remained unfruitful. The rumors that circulated about Marie Antoinette during this period, of affairs, of licentiousness, of behavior unbecoming a dauphine, originated largely with the faction that would benefit most from her failure. In 1777, Marie Antoinette's brother, Emperor Joseph II, traveled to Versailles specifically to address the situation. He was, by all accounts, unsparing with both his sister and Louis in his assessment of what needed to happen. He wrote to his brother afterward, with characteristic Habsburg bluntness, about the state of their sister's marriage. The visit accomplished what 7 years of diplomatic correspondence had not. Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child, a daughter, Marie Theresa Charlotte, on December 19, 1778. She was 23 years old. The birth had taken place 8.5 years after the wedding. The crowds in Paris celebrated with a jubilation that was partly relief. Let us talk about the clothes, not because they are the whole story. They are not, and they have been used too often to flatten a complicated woman into a caricature. But because, in Marie Antoinette's case, fashion was not vanity, it was a language, and she spoke it with the precision of someone who understood, however instinctively, that in a court where every gesture was noted and every detail weighed, what you wore was a form of speech. She met Rose Bertin in 1774, shortly after Louis XVI's coronation. Bertin was a milliner's daughter from Abbeville, not an aristocrat, not a courtier, not a woman who by any conventional measure should have gained access to the Queen of France. She had opened a shop called Le Grand Mogul on the Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris, on pure talent and fearsome ambition, and her clientele had grown to include over 1,500 customers, among them the queens of Sweden, Spain, and Portugal. When she finally met Marie Antoinette, Bertin is said to have told her, "A queen does not follow fashion. Fashion follows her." Marie Antoinette kept her for 20 years. Twice a week, Bertin arrived at Versailles with her newest work. The sessions were conducted behind closed doors. No ladies-in-waiting, no hovering courtiers. And this alone was a small revolution. The centuries-old ritual of dressing in full view of ranked observers was abandoned for these appointments. Bertin became confidant, collaborator, and, in the language of the age, the minister of fashion. What she and Marie Antoinette built together redrew the map of European style. Gowns made in Paris were shipped to London, Venice, St. Petersburg, and Constantinople. French couture as a global institution begins, in no small part, here, in those closed hours, between a queen and her dressmaker. And then there were the hairstyles. Working alongside the queen's hairdresser, Léonard Autier, Bertin engineered constructions that made the act of getting dressed into something approaching performance art. The pouf, a towering structure of wire armature, horsehair, pomade, powder, and the wearer's own hair, grew, under Marie Antoinette's patronage, to heights of up to 3 feet. But they were not merely tall, they told stories. When France celebrated a naval victory over the British in 1778, Marie Antoinette appeared with a fully rigged miniature of the warship La Belle Poule arranged in her hair. When she persuaded Louis XVI to be vaccinated against smallpox, she wore a pouf commemorating it, a serpent coiled in an olive tree, the golden sun of the Enlightenment rising behind it. Her head was a headline. Because they were so expensive and time-consuming to dismantle, women wore them for a week or more at a time, sleeping propped upright on towers of pillows. They bred vermin. Purpose-made head-scratchers were sold as accessories. The satirists had a field day, and they were not wrong. But what they missed, in their caricatures of towering absurdity, was that the women who wore these things were participating in a visual culture with its own grammar and its own stakes. The spending was real. In her peak years, Marie Antoinette spent some 300,000 livres annually on her wardrobe. For a country sliding toward fiscal catastrophe, the debt compounded by war, by structural failure, by the staggering cost of France's support for the American Revolution, a war the Queen herself had pressed Louis to enter, the optics were ruinous. Pamphleteers printed by the thousands. She became Madame Deficit, the name attached like a brand. What those pamphlets did not print, that she adopted an orphan named Armand in 1776, who lived within the royal household until the revolution pulled him away. That she took in a young Senegalese boy, 3 orphaned girls, and provided financial support to many others beyond them. That she once stopped her carriage to personally tend to a peasant gored by a wild animal she encountered on her route. That she once, on New Year's, declined to purchase gifts for her own children because she could not reconcile the expense with the poverty she knew existed beyond Versailles' gates. She never said, "Let them eat cake." The phrase, attributed in French as qu'il mange de la brioche, predates her time as queen by decades. Jean-Jacques Rousseau recorded a version of it in his Confessions, written when Marie Antoinette was still in Vienna playing with dolls. It was propaganda, and the most effective propaganda is the kind that confirms what people already believe. France needed her guilty. The line fit perfectly. It has outlasted everything. When Louis XVI ascended the throne in May 1774, following the death of Louis XV from smallpox, one of his first acts was to give his wife the Petit Trianon. It was a small neoclassical palace set within the grounds of Versailles, originally built for Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, between 1762 and 1768. It had never been completed in her lifetime. It was now the Queen's. She is recorded to have said of it, "When I am at Trianon, I am myself." What she built there over the following years is a more complete portrait of who she actually was than anything the pamphlets assembled. She redesigned the gardens in the English style, naturalistic, deliberately unruly, a calculated rejection of the formal geometry that governed Versailles. She commissioned the Hameau de la Reine nearby, the Queen's Hamlet, 12 thatched buildings arranged around a working farm and a pond. She walked there. She gathered her children there. The cottages' exteriors were artfully weathered. Inside, they were decorated with rich fabrics and fine furnishings. The pastoral was a performance, but it was a performance she chose for herself, and that distinction mattered to her. Inside the Petit Trianon, she exercised a taste that departed sharply from the gilded excess of Versailles' state apartments. She favored the neoclassical, cleaner lines, lighter palettes, rooms built for habitation rather than ceremony. Her boudoir featured mirrored panels that could be raised or lowered by turning a crank to cover the windows and reflect the candlelight, or to reveal the garden beyond. Her bedroom was furnished by the cabinet makers Georges Jacob and Jean-Henri Riesner, Jacob's signature pieces carved with flowers and garlands, upholstered in embroidered Lyons silk. Her palette ran to cornflower blue, lilac, pale green, and ivory. Porcelain from the Sèvres manufactory sat throughout. Her most celebrated service, commissioned in 1781, featuring pearls and cornflowers, comprised 295 pieces, including 120 plates. She preferred to dine privately rather than at the state table, and she built the Trianon spaces around that preference. She commissioned her own theater on the grounds in 1778, completed in 1780, small, seating 250, decorated in blue, white, and gold. Its ornate friezes and garlands crafted not from gilt wood, but from papier-mâché and wire, the statues that appeared to be bronze carved from wood and painted. All of it was, in its way, make-believe. The theater of a woman who understood that elegance was a construction and had decided to construct it on her own terms. She performed in it herself. She took roles as shepherdesses, chambermaids, village women, the ordinary people her station forbade her from being. She invited the servants of the Trianon to sit in the audience while she and her circle performed on the stage, the hierarchy of Versailles deliberately inverted for an evening. She staged works by her favorites, Gluck, whose music she had studied as a child in Vienna and whom she championed at the French court, Grétry, Pesiello. Pesiello's Barbiere di Siviglia, first performed in St. Petersburg for Catherine the Great, had its French premiere at the Trianon Theatre in 1784. She gambled. Card games at Versailles were routine. She played with an intensity that occasionally extended through entire nights, and at stakes that alarmed her household and embarrassed the Austrian ambassador, who reported her habits to her mother in terms he found difficult to soften. She rode horses. She walked in her gardens for hours. Her musical gifts were genuine and documented. The harp she played at the Petit Trianon is still there. She accompanied Antonio Salieri. She sang well enough that her performances had been noted with admiration during the family evenings at Schönbrunn, and she continued to perform privately throughout her years at Versailles. Her library of 5,000 books was weighted toward music and history, but it was not a decorative collection. She had an official reader appointed to read to her. She engaged actively with the intellectual culture of her age, even as that culture was, in some of its currents, producing the ideas that would eventually kill her. She left behind a comprehensive record of her wardrobe, the Gazette des Auteurs, maintained by her mistress of the robes, in which swatches of fabric, color notes, and illustrated records of every gown were compiled. Each morning it was presented to her with a pincushion, and she selected what she would wear by pressing a pin into the page of her choice. It is, among other things, an archive of extraordinary precision, the most complete record of an 18th century royal wardrobe in existence. It was at the Petit Trianon that the question of Count Axel von Fersen became most pointed. Fersen was a Swedish nobleman who had first encountered Marie Antoinette at a masked ball in 1774 when he was 18. He re-entered her life in 1778 after serving in the American Revolutionary War under Rochambeau, and he had his own apartment directly above hers at the Trianon. Their correspondence, portions heavily redacted by Fersen himself before historians could access them, contains passages of unmistakable intimacy. His return to Versailles in late 1784 occurred exactly 9 months before the birth of her second son, Louis Charles, in March 1785. The timing did not escape notice then, and has not escaped historians since. The majority of serious scholars, including Antonia Fraser and Stefan Zweig, conclude that Louis Charles was the biological son of the king, with Fraser noting the dates align with a documented conjugal visit, and that courtiers recorded an extended period the king and queen spent together immediately prior to conception. What is harder to dismiss is that Fersen and Marie Antoinette shared something, whether or not it crossed the threshold of physical infidelity, that the historical record never resolved, and that Fersen, by systematically redacting their letters, ensured it never would be. She was not the woman the pamphlets printed. She was also not a saint. She spent extravagantly in a country that was starving, and she knew it was starving, and she did not always stop. But she was a woman of genuine and varied appetites, for music, for theater, for beauty in small and carefully considered things, for the company of people who made her laugh. And these appetites were used against her in ways that had more to do with what she represented than what she had done. She said once that she put on her rouge and washed her hands in front of the whole world. What the Petit Trianon makes plain is that she also maintained, with considerable determination, a version of herself that was not for the whole world at all. She had 4 children. Of those 4, one survived. The first was born on December 19th, 1778, after 8.5 years of marriage and a delivery so difficult that the overcrowded, unventilated room had to have its windows broken open to revive the queen. The child was a girl. In the hierarchy of dynastic priorities, this was a disappointment. When Marie Antoinette was told she had been semi-conscious during the birth, she did not treat it as one. She is recorded to have said, "Poor little girl, you are not what was desired, but you are no less dear to me on that account. A son would have been property of the state. You shall be mine." The girl was named Marie Theresa Charlotte and called Madame Royale. She was her mother's closest companion at Versailles when protocol permitted, which was not as often as either of them would have chosen. Royal etiquette governed the children's household as thoroughly as it governed everything else. Marie Antoinette fought it where she could. She insisted on nursing Marie Therese herself against court tradition. She retreated with her children to the Petit Trianon when she needed them near her. She supervised their education personally. Her son, Louis Joseph, was born in October 1781. He was the dauphin, the heir, and by all accounts, a bright and gentle boy, though he was never entirely well. From early in his life, he suffered with his health, a frailty that doctors could not resolve. His spine began to curve. The fevers came and went. He bore it without complaint that anyone recorded. He died on June 4th, 1789. He was 7 years old. The cause was tuberculosis of the spine. The Bastille fell 6 weeks later. Marie Antoinette had just buried her son when the revolution began to consume what remained of her world. There was no period of mourning. There was no space for it. History did not pause. Her third child, Louis Charles, was born in March 1785, the boy whose paternity the court had made into a subject of open speculation. When Louis Joseph died, Louis Charles became the new dauphin. He was 4 years old. He would spend the last 3 years of his life in captivity. After his father's execution in January 1793, he was separated from his mother and placed under the supervision of a man named Antoine Simon, tasked with his revolutionary re-education. He was 8 years old. He was held in the Temple prison, isolated in conditions that deteriorated steadily. He was coerced into signing accusations against his own mother and made to repeat them at her trial. He died on June 8th, 1795, in his cell. He was 10 years old. The cause, confirmed by autopsy, was tuberculosis. His heart was preserved by the attending doctor and kept for over 2 centuries. In the year 2000, testing matched it conclusively to the royal line. The mythology of escape and survival that had grown around him for generations, the lost dauphin, the rescued king, dissolved against a single confirmed fact. He had never left. He had died alone in a prison room at 10 years old. The youngest child was Sophie Hélène Béatrix, born in July 1786, premature and fragile from the first day. She died in June 1787. She was 11 months old. Her death came before Louis Joseph, before Louis Charles, before everything. Marie Antoinette was 31 years old and had already buried a child. There is a portrait painted in 1787, the year Sophie died, in which Marie Antoinette sits with her 3 surviving children. Louis Joseph points to an empty cradle beside them. The artist included it deliberately to record Sophie's absence. Marie Antoinette asked to see the finished painting and wept. Of her 4 children, Marie Therese Charlotte alone survived. She was imprisoned in the Temple after her mother's execution and remained there for 2 years, cut off from news of her family, able to hear her brother's cries from another part of the building and unable to reach him. She was released in December 1795, 2.5 years after her mother's death, exchanged for French prisoners held in Austria. She was 17 years old. She lived to be 72. She never had children. She forgave, in her final testament, those who had made her life what it had been. She said she followed in this the example of her parents. It was into this atmosphere, of whispered affairs, of pamphlets multiplying in the gutters of Paris, of a queen whose reputation had been slowly dismantled by people who had never met her, that the most damaging scandal of her life arrived. And it arrived with a cruelty that history rarely troubles to arrange so neatly, in the form of a crime she did not commit. There is something almost operatic about the diamond necklace affair, the scale of the deception, the recklessness of the players, the injustice of who paid for it. It would be farcical if the consequences had not been so catastrophic. And the cruelest part, the part history keeps insisting upon, is this: Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with it. The necklace had been commissioned years earlier by Louis XV as a gift for his mistress, Madame du Barry. The jewelers Böhmer and Bassange had assembled it across years of labor. 647 diamonds arranged in festoons, pendants, and tassels. Its total cost 1.6 million livres. Then the king died before purchasing it. Du Barry was banished. The jewelers were left holding the most expensive object in France with no buyer. They approached Marie Antoinette repeatedly. She declined, on the grounds that France needed warships more than the queen needed jewelry. This detail never made it into the pamphlets. Into this gap stepped Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy, Comtesse de la Motte, a woman of almost supernatural audacity and a talent for fiction that would have made her fortune in another age. She had minor royal blood, substantial debts, and zero compunction. She invented a close friendship with the queen and used it to ensnare her real target, Cardinal de Rohan, Prince de Rohan-Guémené, a man of extravagant vanity and a wound he could not stop pressing. Marie Antoinette had loathed him since childhood. Since his tenure as French ambassador to Vienna, she had not addressed a single word to him at court, not once, despite his high clerical position. The Comtesse told him the queen had forgiven him in confidence, that she wished to purchase the necklace through him, discreetly, as an intermediary. Rohan, who wanted this to be true with the full force of his considerable ego, believed her. To seal his conviction, the Comtesse arranged a nocturnal meeting in the gardens of Versailles. In darkness, Rohan was led to a young woman who bore a resemblance to the queen, actually a Parisian prostitute named Nicole Lequay, hired for the occasion, who murmured a few words and handed him a rose. Rohan went home convinced he had met the Queen of France in shadow. He signed for the necklace. It was carried to London, broken apart, and sold stone by stone. When the fraud collapsed in 1785, Marie Antoinette, furious and convinced that a public trial would vindicate her, overruled her advisors and insisted on it. They told her not to. They were correct in this. The trial became the most public dismantling of a reputation in the history of the French monarchy. Every piece of gossip that had ever attached itself to the queen was rehearsed in open court, in detail, regardless of its relevance to the actual crime. Rohan was acquitted. The Comtesse was convicted, branded, and imprisoned. She later escaped and wrote a memoir blaming everything on the queen. Marie Antoinette, who had committed no crime and suffered the greatest injury, emerged from the proceedings destroyed. The French public chose to believe she was guilty. The alternative, that a fraud had been committed in her name by people she had never met, without her knowledge, was a less satisfying story. Guilt was cleaner. Guilt fit the Madame Deficit they had already decided she was. The trial ended. Her character had already been condemned. The summer of 1789 arrived like a verdict. France's financial system had been fracturing for years before it finally broke. The national debt, compounded by decades of court expenditure, by the ruinous cost of the American Revolutionary War, by structural failures that no minister had managed to reform, had grown beyond the capacity of ordinary taxation to address. Then the harvest of 1788 failed. Grain prices spiked. Bread, the staple on which ordinary French life depended, became something working families could not reliably afford. The gap between what the state spent and what the people could eat was not abstract. It was felt in the body every day. When Louis XVI convened the Estates General in May 1789, the first such assembly in 175 years, he was hoping for an orderly discussion of fiscal reform. What he got was something else entirely. The Third Estate, representing commoners, declared itself a national assembly. The king locked them out of their meeting hall. They convened on a nearby tennis court and swore not to disperse until France had a constitution. On July 14th, a Paris crowd stormed the Bastille, a fortress and prison that had come to symbolize royal authority, and dismantled it stone by stone. By October, a march of thousands of women from Paris had descended on Versailles demanding bread. The royal family was escorted back to the capital under armed guard and installed in the Tuileries Palace. They would not see Versailles again. Marie Antoinette had, until this moment, been largely apolitical. Her influence over Louis had been real but episodic, more focused on patronage and court appointments than on policy. Now, with the monarchy under existential threat, she became its most determined defender and its most politically active member, sometimes to its detriment. She corresponded in secret with her brother, Emperor Joseph II, and later his successor, Leopold II, urging Austrian intervention to crush the revolution by force. She negotiated simultaneously with revolutionary factions, attempting to manage an impossible situation with insufficient information and no reliable advisors. Her instinct was to resist. Louis's instinct was toward concession, toward accommodation, toward the path of least confrontation. The gap between their political temperaments widened as the crisis deepened. In June 1791, they fled. The plan, organized largely with Fersen's assistance, was to reach the Austrian border, where loyal troops awaited. The royal family traveled in a large Berlin carriage, disguised as the household of a Russian baroness. It was a spectacular miscalculation. The carriage was unwieldy and conspicuous. The journey was slow. A postmaster in the town of Varennes recognized the king from his portrait on the currency. The family was stopped, surrounded, and returned to Paris under armed escort. Crowds lined the roads all the way. None of them cheered. After Varennes, the pretense that the king and queen were participants in the revolution, rather than its prisoners, became impossible to maintain. Louis XVI was executed on January 21st, 1793. Marie Antoinette, imprisoned in the Temple Tower with her children, was not present. She learned of his death when the room fell silent and the guards outside did not return. In August 1793, she was transferred to the Conciergerie, a medieval structure on the Ile de la Cité, damp and cold even in summer. Her cell measured roughly 12 feet by 12 feet. She was 48 hours from her execution from the moment she arrived. In the event, she remained there for 76 days. What happened in the Conciergerie is among the most disturbing chapters of the story. Her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, separated from his mother months earlier, had been placed under the influence of Antoine Simon, a cobbler appointed by the revolutionary government to oversee his re-education. Simon's methods were not subtle. He plied the boy with wine until he was drunk, taught him revolutionary obscenities, and kept him in conditions of deliberate degradation. On October 6, 1793, Simon arrived at the temple alongside the radical journalist Jacques Hébert, the mayor of Paris-Pache, and several other officials. They gathered around the drunk 8-year-old and secured his signature on a written statement accusing his mother and his aunt, Madame Elizabeth, of sexual abuse. The child could not have understood what he was signing, and there is every reason to believe he did not. At Marie Antoinette's trial, Hébert produced that document and presented the accusation to the court himself. Louis Charles never appeared in court. He was never asked to stand before a tribunal. The weapon used against his mother was a piece of paper bearing the uncomprehending signature of a drunk and frightened child. When the accusation was read aloud in court, Marie Antoinette rose from her seat. She appealed to every mother in the room. She called the accusation too abhorrent for nature itself to contemplate. It was the most electrifying moment of the proceedings. Even some of those present who had scorned her were said to have been shaken. The trial ran across 2 days, the active proceedings spanning some 15 hours. She was unanimously found guilty of treason, of depleting the national treasury, and of conspiring with foreign powers. Charges assembled from documented fact, reasonable inference, and outright fabrication. The sentence was fixed before the proceedings opened. The night before her execution, Marie Antoinette wrote a letter. It was addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, and it was the last piece of writing she would ever produce. In it, she described her children. She asked that her son be forgiven for what he had been made to say about her at trial. She knew, or had chosen to believe, that he had not understood what he was doing. She wrote that she was calm. She wrote that she was not afraid. Whether she was telling the truth is a question no one can answer. What we know is that the letter never reached Madame Elisabeth. It was intercepted and archived. It was not made public for decades after her death. On the morning of October 16th, the executioner Henri Sanson came to her cell. Her hair, once the tallest in Europe, the scaffolding of poufs 3 feet high, the architecture of a woman performing her role in the only language available to her, had gone white during the months of captivity. He cut what remained of it himself, close to the skull. She was given a plain white dress, a white bonnet, the white of French royal mourning. She had worn it before, for others. Now she wore it for herself. She was placed not in an enclosed carriage, the dignity afforded to Louis XVI on his final journey, but in an open cart. The route through Paris took over an hour. The exposure was deliberate. The humiliation was the point. She sat upright the whole way. She looked at the city she had arrived in as a 14-year-old girl with 376 horsemen flanking her procession and the crowds cheering from the roadside, the city that had adored her and then reviled her and was now bearing witness as she passed for the last time, and she did not look away. At the foot of the scaffold, in the confusion of climbing the steps, she accidentally trod on the foot of Henri Sanson. She turned to him. "Pardon, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." Those were her last words. An apology, reflex, grace, or one final insistence on the manners she had been taught before she knew what any of this would cost her. She died at 15 minutes past noon. She was 37 years and 11 months old. Her remains went into an unmarked grave in the cemetery of the Madeleine. No stone, no name. The revolution had no interest in monuments to its victims. 22 years later, in 1815, her bones and those of Louis XVI were exhumed and carried to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the burial ground of the kings of France, where she had always, by right of the crown she wore, belonged. It took the fall of everything she had tried to save for the acknowledgement to come. What she left behind, beyond the grave, one surviving child, Marie Theresa Charlotte, who outlived her mother by 58 years and never fully recovered from any of it. A library of 5,000 books at Versailles, a fashion legacy that positioned France as the unrivaled center of the global couture industry, a position the country still holds, 2.5 centuries on, because a queen and her dressmaker spent closed hours together remaking what elegance could mean. She left behind letters, the ones that survived Fersen's redactions, the ones the revolutionary tribunals chose not to destroy, that reveal a woman far more observant, more sardonic, and more clear-eyed about her situation than the simpering caricatures ever allowed. She left behind the letter to Madame Elisabeth, the one that was never delivered, that sat in an archive for decades before anyone read it. In it, she had written, "I put on my rouge and wash my hands in front of the whole world." She had spent her adult life under constant observation. Every morning, at the levee at Versailles, courtiers noted her dress. Every evening, the pamphlet writers imagined what she had done behind closed doors. At her trial, the crowd studied her face for signs of guilt. On the cart through Paris, thousands pressed close enough to see her breathe. She was never, across nearly 4 decades, permitted the ordinary privacy of being unobserved. And yet, in the surviving accounts of those who watched her climb those 13 steps, there is a consistency that crosses the lines of faction and sympathy and outright hatred. She did not stumble. She did not weep. She did not perform anything, at the very end, except the simple act of continuing to move forward when everything ahead of her had already been settled. That is what they could not take, the manner of it. She was 37 years old. She had been sent to France at 14 to hold an alliance together with her body and her obedience, and her willingness to become whatever France demanded of her. She had done it, and France had demanded in the end her death. History named her Madame Deficit. She died owing France nothing.
Thank you everyone so much for watching Cultured Elegance. If you'd love to support the channel, you can become a channel member today by clicking Join at the bottom of the screen. Thank you everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.